Hello and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today I am joined with my friend Warren to discuss my existentialist theory. I've been thinking about a lot recently when when reading Feuerbach, and also thinking about a girl that I liked, idealized. I don't know how to say it, but I essentially managed through all that confusion and complication, came up with quite an interesting existential theory, which I think is just absolutely vital to humans. Less so really my theory being vital, but the need for a solution to the problem of nihilism, which is very vital. And as a result, I thought there's no better way than to invite Warren onto my channel to discuss this together. And let's get right into it.
Well, how about your new existentialism? I think that's the main thing we want to talk about today.
Indeed, I think we both have found existentialist theories or theses, and it's something that I've been struggling with recently, because perhaps you've tuned in on our previous podcast on love, and we discussed a lot about our ideas of love. Well, I mean, it fundamentally started off with my discussion about the ideal. I was thinking about the ideal and actually how it lies in and how it interplays with our lives, because, you know, no one seems to live without an ideal, or at least in some shape or form, or whatever way you put it. We all have our ideals in some sense. And the question really is, well, where exactly do we get this ideal? What exactly is this ideal? And also, well, what is the nature of it? And as a result, I wrote this essay for the Psychology Harrovian, and one of our friends drew a picture accompanying it, and it looks really beautiful. I have to admit, her drawing of Sisyphus was just so profound, and I looked at that, I was like, wow, this is very beautiful. Because you know
what I picked? You know what I picked for the picture? I picked like Dante walking into the Inferno at the moment before he enters the gates. I don't know how they're going to portray it.
Yes, indeed.
I think I picked an impossible task.
Indeed. But then actually, yeah, that's a funny thing, is that I was talking about, and in this essay, and I might publish it on my blog later. So if I do, of course, I'll let you guys know. But essentially, the kind of idea is
talking about blog, talking about the blog, you can visit. If you're interested, you can visit warrenzhu.com.
Yes, indeed. It's a very profound thing with Warren Zhu poems in it. So it's quite interesting. But essentially, let's keep on going with the ideal talk. And I was kind of thinking about, well, what's the nature of the ideal? And my hypothesis is that, well, the ideal is always used as a solution. It's less so of perhaps a goal that is ought to be achieved, but rather that ideal is a solution to our problems. And if we think more about that, I was thinking, and of course I was reading this in line with Feuerbach, and I think Feuerbach is definitely a very profound thinker and a very interesting, insightful thinker as well, as for that matter. And I was reading some Feuerbach, and his fundamental thesis is the idea that, well, man's conscious or man's divination or creation of God came from his fundamental conscious of the infinite. And of course, I think that's wrong prima facie, because it is, well, I don't necessarily think that on atheism man can have a conscious of the infinite. But then, because, well, if you're evolving, assuming that you evolve from finite consciousness, it's mathematically impossible, or even physically impossible, to suddenly gain an infinite consciousness out of nowhere or via successive addition. However, we do seem to have this idea of an infinite consciousness, and I definitely agree with him in that analysis, in the sense that we do have an understanding of the infinite consciousness, and that is ultimately the ideal. And of course, this is a great reduction or a summary. Yep.
Wait, can you try to explain the idea of the infinite consciousness? Because I'm afraid people who haven't read Feuerbach may not be able to follow this.
Mm-hmm. Well, the infinite conscious is perhaps more simple than it might sound. It sounds like a very infinite topic, perhaps, but in reality, it's just the idea that man has conception or understanding of something which is infinite. And to tie it in, or perhaps a more concrete demonstration of it is Feuerbach's statement that he less so believes in the making of God into man, because he fundamentally says that man created God. But instead of saying, well, God was completely like just a man-made construction, he's more saying that that man himself is deified. He believes in the deified man, in the sense that God is essentially the person, the human spirit, emphasized or realized in its most raw and beautiful form. And as a result, that is kind of his idea of the infinite conscious, is the idea that man ultimately, when brought into its totality, can become or transforms into a very, very godlike creature, at least internally, whereas may not be externally. And that's kind of Feuerbach's idea of the infinite conscious. It's That's kind of the fundamental thesis where he starts off his critique of Christianity. And of course, I don't grant that initial assumption that man has an infinite conscious. I say that man has an infinite conscious only if something else gave him an infinite conscious altogether at once, rather than being evolved. However, if you grant that man has an infinite conscience, I think you could get a very pure and a very profound existentialist conclusion from it.
Yeah, I'm following. So, are you saying that Feuerbach is trying to say that the idea of God is this ultimate ideal of the best man or woman, for that matter, that we can imagine, and that is what we put into this idea of God, and what you're sort of saying is that the ideal, this ultimate goodness that we sort of personify, or we put in as God, is it can only come to us through something divine, because us by ourselves won't be able to achieve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think that's fundamentally at the heart of kind of the what do you call it? It's at the heart of the Imago Dei theology, and I think that's the best way to put it. It's the anthropomorphism and Imago Dei theology. We like to say God is anthropomorphic, or at least most people. But then if you realize that there is, and I think this is where Feuerbach is very profound in saying that he recognizes that man has some sort of the divine inside him. And I think that is right. We have an understanding of what God is, or at least the constructs or the broadest concepts of God is found within the heart of man. The only question is, I think the existence of that belief, the consciousness of the infinite is kind of very, I wouldn't say obvious, but it's very intuitive and it's something that you can interact with, no matter how weird or extreme it sounds. And I think that interaction with it makes it seem that it's absolutely vital for human existence. And I think that is undeniable. The only question is where it comes from. And that's kind of a bit of perhaps the grounding of my existentialist philosophy, but though I don't necessarily think that my existentialist philosophy is fully required to understand where it came from to be able for it to be built, if you got what I mean.
Okay. So, well, I'll play the devil's advocate here. To be, I guess, more cynical about this, could you not say that this ideal is just a societal construction? Because, well, we're born into a culture and into a certain language. I'll wait until you're good. We're born into a culture and born into language, and because of this, we inherit a certain hierarchy of values, and it is in language, not in anything outside of man, not in the divine, how we get this idea of God or the idea of the ideal. It's solely within the symbolic, the language itself, that we find it. At least that's what I think would be a good sort of objection.
But I suppose a question or a problem with that idea is, well, yes, it would explain for imperfect ideals. Like if your imperfect ideal is that of perhaps I want to just improve my situation, I think that's a very good way to go around it. But the problem is that a lot of times ideals is not just an imperfect ideal, a stage which you're meant to be moving towards, but you can accomplish. A lot of times, I think we all experience this is well, not only are we divining what is imperfect, we're divining or we're creating that which is perfect. And that idea of we're creating a perfect representation or a perfect society, as in perhaps like kind of a Marxian idea, is perhaps different from this idea of a societal construct which came from humans, if you got what I mean. I think there's a fundamental difference or a fundamental impossibility of man creating an infinite ideal without first understanding of the infinite consciousness, like Feuerbach.
Well, okay, I'll push you a bit more on this.
Mm-hmm.
I see a problem in your argument, because you're arguing for you're arguing using the language that we have inherited for something that you said cannot be just a construct in our language. Because when you say the infinite consciousness, these two concepts are not something out there. It's part of our language, and we gain an idea of these words through the language. And what I think is it's a similar thing with ideal. And one can perhaps say that the ideal is infinitely good, but on what basis are we saying that the ideal is infinitely good, except on the basis of the concept of the infinite, which we have inherited from our own language? So I feel like we can't really get out of, we can't really access the divine, at least logically here, because whenever we try to describe the ideal, we're using the concepts that we have inherited from our culture.
Well, I think we have to go further or deeper into, well, where did we get that language from in the first place? Because I think if we think about it in this way, right, we have, well, language is that which comes from within, or language is, how did language arise? It's to describe that which we experience and that which we know, perhaps, in greater or smaller extent. And I mean, that's a rather vague and perhaps disputable definition of language. But I think either way we go, we get to some kind of consensus that language is a bit of a tool, or it's somewhat of an explanation. And if we have kind of the idea that language came from ourselves, or a kind of an intrinsic imposition or a construction about the world, or as a convention kind of used coming from within, I think that what I'm saying by the intrinsic construction, or the intrinsic, or the infinite consciousness, is also an internal construct, or it also is a fundamental thing which we all know deep down, and then is emphasized or embodied by the language that we use. It's not necessarily kind of a circle where we have that. We first have the language, and then we have the idea of the infinite construction, or the infinite consciousness. We first have the knowledge of the infinite consciousness before we then get into its language or codified form of it. Because in the same way in which you will perhaps say, well, what is the subconscious? Did we get the word the subconscious first, or did we first understand the subconscious understanding, or the subconscious interactions within our brain or our hearts? It seems that it first comes from within before it goes out. And in the same way, I think the same thing could be said with the infinite consciousness.
Okay, so it's almost linked with the feeling of awe, or this complete feeling of the divine presence when you experience this absolute beauty, that the tools of language, if we are to call language a tool, cannot suffice to really codify what we have experienced. And is it almost that thing that they are calling the infinite consciousness, in some sense, that which lies in the real being the part of the world that has not yet been captured by language, and that which lies in the real and brings us the sense of awe and beauty, and that which we strive towards.
Well, suppose that would be perhaps the development of the first infinite consciousness. Because I think the infinite consciousness would be embodied or realized in the things that you say. It's like awe, it's in beauty, it's in the good. But first of all, it comes from within. It comes from within and is reflected in the world. And that's kind of what Feuerbach says with God. And and of course, every time I say, well, Feuerbach, you have to just think or already assume that the infinite consciousness has first come from God. That's kind of my first assumption. But then, of course, if you don't accept it's come from God, then there's a bit of a question there. But essentially what I'm saying, or at least what my argument or my idea is kind of saying, is that, well, we first understand the infinite within us. We don't necessarily know what exactly it is, but rather we what we do is that we experience, or we feel the nature that the finite cannot fully explain that which is experienced by man, or the finite is not sufficient to fully encompass the depth of the human consciousness, the depth of the human experience. And that's just kind of, we have the knowledge of the infinite. We don't necessarily have the idea of what is the infinite, but we do have the understanding of, well, it is there. We feel it. We interact with it, but we don't necessarily know exactly what it is. We only know what it is from perhaps its reflections in reality when we do start imposing it in reality, and then we understand it. For example, perhaps it's like kind of like with the girl that I kind of idealized quite a lot. It was like I didn't understand fully about the nature of the ideal until I first imposed it in the world. I knew there was the ideal within me, and I knew it was somewhat infinite, but I fully understood, or I wouldn't say fully, but I further understood what it is via its reflection into the world and my usage and my interaction with said reflection in the world.
Okay, so I think the last example you gave made it much more easier to understand.
Yes.
Well, a follow-up question, just to clear things up. So we have the idea of the infinite consciousness from birth. Is it like as soon as we're born, or?
Well, I think it's there in the same sense. I think subconsciousness and these other things are there, but at the same time, I think it's not fully developed. It's kind of how the longer you live, the more you understand about your subconscious, your own consciousness. In the same way, the growth that you're having in your sense of self-knowledge also helps your growth and understanding of the infinite consciousness. I wouldn't say a kid knows about the infinite consciousness, but it's not necessarily there to say that infinite consciousness doesn't exist within him. The more he grows older and the more he interacts, the more he understands it's fundamentally within him. Because I think you look at these kind of the ideal, or how we use ideals, especially perfect ideals in this world, we know that what we're idealizing, or what we're raising to be infinite in perfection, is not necessarily infinite in perfection in themselves. We attach that concept to the imperfect thing in reality. And the question is, well, how did we get that attachment or that label to the thing in reality? And it seems that it comes from within us. I think that's what Feuerbach says with the infinite consciousness. That's what Feuerbach says with God. We're attributing our understanding of the infinite consciousness to God in reality, or we're attributing that infinite consciousness to the statue in reality. And in the same way, that's what we're doing. We're attributing our understanding, our shaky understanding of the infinite consciousness, to ideals in reality. And then by doing that and by establishing them as ideals in reality, what we then see is that we slowly interact with them, and then we furthermore slowly understand our own infinite consciousness.
Okay, I think I fully understand, or not fully understand, but I got a clear picture now. So it's almost like we by applying or by pursuing the ideal in reality is able to, we are able to really, I guess, develop, let the concept blossom, or just fully realize our concept of the infinite consciousness as we go in this kind of cyclical movement of applying it to reality, finding an ideal, and then coming back to ourselves and understanding more about the sort of higher order ideal, or this infinite consciousness that is the driving force of everything we do.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the case. And furthermore, to build on that, is that we use the ideal, we apply that infinite consciousness when we're faced with struggles and suffering. Of course, you can apply it when you don't have struggles and suffering, but it's just that struggles and suffering makes it easier for you to apply that infinite ideal. In your darkness, it's kind of how when you're in a room, when you're in a room with the lights on, the candle doesn't look that bright. But when you have darkness, the candle looks so much brighter. In the same way, you have that infinite consciousness, but when everything is going good, your applications of them to the world is minimized. But when things go bad, that infinite consciousness is made so much more lucid, and then you further understand that understanding of the infinite consciousness. And here is where my fundamental conclusion arises from, perhaps, and is the idea that, well, if it's true that our infinite consciousness fundamentally comes from within us, then when we're facing with struggling and pain and suffering, it also tells us that the solutions to these problems, the ideal, is also within us. We already have the solutions to the problems that we face. We just have to find a way to fight it and overcome that suffering from within. If you
Okay.
kind of
Yeah. Well, this reminds me a lot of Plato's doctrine that all knowledge is just remembrance. Is it sort of in the same way that when we're facing with great, I guess, darkness, adversity, it is exactly the time where we have to dive within and really understand what exactly is driving our life, or what exactly is endowing our lives with meaning. And that ideal is what we're calling here the infinite consciousness.
I think that's very true, and I think you've picked up very well on the intrinsic search for the infinite consciousness. And I do think there's also an extrinsic search for the infinite consciousness. Man not only finds it within him, he also imposes it on in the world. And by interacting with the world and really looking out for it, for example, how I really looked out for it in the world, I found that girl, in which it was there since the beginning, but it just was that suffering, the experience, the situation which made that shine way brighter. It was via that extrinsic look, which then further emphasized my intrinsic look. So it's kind of this interplay. Kind of the world is perhaps how you're fishing. You already have, as a fisherman, you already have the fishing skills within you. But it's only when you're going fishing in the world that you actually catch fish. In the same way, you already have that skill of finding the intrinsic consciousness within you. You have the ability, you have the bait. But then it's only when you actually go fishing in it, then you find it. And perhaps an even more lucid thing, I think, to develop that analogy is imagine a fish pond owner. He already owns all the fish. The ideal is already owned in him. But it's via actually fishing, actually catching, actually experimenting in the external world, which is the pond, which he already owns. He then brings it out, and then from within finds it outside, and then brings it in again. And it's kind of that circle, which I think helps us further develop the infinite consciousness and provides kind of that meaning and purpose that we can find, and at least that hope, which that we do have an infinite within us, and that via that infinite consciousness, we can solve our problems. It's not all hopeless. It's not all dark. We can find that light, and it's not that light is away from you, but it's actually within each one of us.
Well, that makes a ton of sense, and I guess I feel like the analogy can even be further developed in the sense that as a fisherman, you can only be better at fishing by going out to fish. So
yeah.
So not only are you sort of, when you go out fishing, not only are you fishing what is already within you, you're also getting better at doing this, and maybe I'm just very curious about, well, what have you learned about the girl after I guess this week?
Well, I have to admit that I learned that the girl. I also came to another conclusion about ideals, is that you can love an ideal of a girl, and then you can like the girl in a completely different way as well. And there's kind of this duality between every single person. Like, you like the person for who he is. And I think the way you like the actual person is your subconscious desire and your liking for that person. Whereas your conscious understanding and interactions with them is based on the image that you have of them in your mind. Because we all have an image of someone else in our mind, which is not necessarily the real image of them. But that image is created by our conscious. We're thinking, we're analyzing what they're like, we're analyzing who they are. Then our subconscious is what drives us towards them in the first place. And that's who the person is in concreto, perhaps. And there's kind of that swap. It's seemingly that the conscious focuses on the abstract and the subconscious focuses on the concrete. There's kind of that disconnect, or perhaps that kind of interplay between that, which I think is a very interesting thing, because I consciously love the girl for the ideal, but I subconsciously liked the girl for who she actually was. I think that was a very interesting thing that I figured out.
That's indeed very interesting, because it almost perfectly maps on to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Because Lacan talked about relationship between egos as this imaginary relationship. It's always imaginary in the sense that you're imposing this, well, I would maybe ideal, or imposing on this expected role on another when you're interacting with them. But he says the real cause of desire, or that's sort of the Freudian name for what we feel when we feel love, is what he calls object small a, and object small a is this thing in the real. So maybe what you said in concreto, it's something that's unmediated by the symbolic, as in it's something that you cannot explain at all. It is something that attracts you, but you can never understand.
Indeed.
Would that fit your sort of situation?
I think it would. Perhaps not directly, but I think it generally kind of is coincided, or is a very similar theory to what I'm experiencing. And perhaps that's my existentialist kind of philosophy. And that's why psychoanalyzing, although it's quite dangerous, that it kind of takes all the love out of love, perhaps, by psychoanalyzing things. But at the same time, it brings you great profundity. And that leads us to another question before we start examining your new existentialist theory. Is do you think losing love for greater profundity is worth the trade to gain great profundity and a theory, or lose the love for a girl? I'm torn.
Do you mean that whether it's worth it for you to gain this new understanding of existentialism by sort of losing your imaginary ideal in a girl?
Yeah.
I don't know how exactly to answer the question, to be honest. Can you try to expand on it?
Or perhaps it's not just that imaginary ideal. Imagine you love someone, right? And you might even have a chance. And of course, the situation with the girl that I idealize, I do not have a chance, perhaps, or at least not as evidently as we think we are. Although from past experiences, I think both of us have realized that experiences are very different from reality. We might actually have a lot more chances than we actually think we did. We might feel very far away. In fact, it was like 50-50 or even like 90-10. But then at the same time, imagine if it was 90-10. Imagine if it was 90-10. Imagine if you had that love for a girl, but you psychoanalyze that love for the girl so much that you no longer loved her and threw away your chance. What is more worth it? The theory and the beauty that you get from the psychoanalysis, or perhaps the love that you've lost? I'm not sure which one's more worth it, if it's just for a girl and not the ideal.
I'd say both of them are infinitely valuable. I don't think one can make a judgment on it. And
indeed. And
back to the question about the chance. Well, I think we talked about this off camera, but Josh here helped me sort of helped me sort of this hidden trauma that I had that I've been harboring for like 2 years since I asked out a girl like 2 years ago. I think I've never resolved the traumatic experience, even though whenever I thought back to the experience, I've always felt extremely embarrassed, and then it just flies away from it. But I haven't realized that that is actually traumatic. You know, I really never understood what Freud meant by trauma until it was resolved. So I feel like there is something true to psychoanalysis, especially due to, I think, our recent experiences, that although a lot of Freud's theory is just complete bogus, there's quite a lot of profundity in it that's often dismissed along with his more absurd stuff. Well, first, I want to ask you a question. How does your new philosophy, I guess, fit into the whole existential schema?
Well, I think Well, I think the reason why I called it existentialist movement is quite personal. I don't think I can necessarily discuss it here, at least not on the YouTube video that we have. I'll tell you a bit about it later, I guess. But essentially, I think the fundamental thing is where I think it kind of ties in to the existentialist thema or the schema is essentially that existentialism is fundamentally asking the question, or asking the problem about where is the meaning found in life. And I think, or how do you face the most bleakest problems in reality, or I think the most simple way to do existentialism, and tell me if I'm wrong, but because it's used in so many different ways throughout the centuries, by like the existentialism of Kierkegaard would be different from the existentialism of Nietzsche, perhaps, or Sartre. But I think they all have a common theme in the sense that existentialism is finding the solution to nihilism. It's the way, perhaps in the Kierkegaardian way, it's the way out of the night of infinite resignation to the night of infinite faith and hope by the leap of faith. And in the same way, I think that my existentialist theory is to say, well, despite the nihilism, despite the struggle that you face around you, despite the toil of Sisyphus, you can fundamentally find something within us that is beautiful. You can find something within us that is great, and that you do not need to search anywhere else but within to find the solution to your ailments, to find a solution to your nihilism. And that it's not a struggle with the world around you that is causing you nihilism, but it is the inability to find the solution within you which will lead you to nihilism. And that's kind of my idea about the idea that we are all granted with the image of God within us. We all have the understanding of God, and it's via that understanding, that infinite consciousness, which is fundamentally the inner destruction, or the inner fighting, or the inner mechanism which is built in against nihilism. And that's kind of where I'm coming from.
It really does sound Kierkegaardian in some sense, especially the use of infinite. But I think it's very profound. No, now I have two separate moral philosophies that I'm working on. The first one comes from a quote from Heidegger in his lecture series, what is called Thinking. He said that we are the mask of being, and when he says the mask of being, he's not saying that we cover being, but in fact we uncover being, because the mask that he was referring to is the mask that the Greeks wore in tragic theater, the persona, and through the persona is the voice of the actor sound through, and it is, and as the mask of being, we are sort of the channel, or I guess the sort of mediating term to let the sound of being, let the truth of being shine through, and I'm calling it a Aristotelian, because there's a teleology associated with this. Recently, I've been thinking. I've been reading Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, and the claim that he's making is that moral claims are meaningless unless you accept a certain teleology. Moral claims are saturated with teleology. Without teleology, you won't be able to do morality, or your moral language will be fundamentally confused. I find it very convincing. So the teleological side of it is that the end of human beings, the teleos, is exactly to be this mask of being, to let being sound through, and we let being sound through in a lot of ways. First, we do it in thinking, when we're thinking very hard about a certain topic, when we're thinking very hard about a certain phenomenon, we're letting it be truly. And I use the word true in a very Heideggerian sense, because Heidegger said that truth is aletheia, truth is revelation, so revealing. With leth is the river, the Greek river of you forgetting, and aletheia. Anyways, that's a side note. So we can let being sound through, either by thinking or just by acting. For example, when we're playing the piano, when we're playing the cello, we're letting the being of the cello or even the being of the music sound through. It's it's very fitting because we're using a music metaphor here, but also we do it when we're in conversation, when we're in full attention towards someone else and conversing with them. We are drawing something out of them, and it's the same thing with giving a gift or teaching someone else. I think it all bogs down. Why it's so fulfilling to do any of these things is that we are fulfilling our end, our teleos, as the mask of being. I don't know what you think about it.
Completely agree with that, and I think teleological reasoning is fundamental to our understanding about morality and discussion, because if humans don't have that fundamental telos, I find it very difficult to ground anything in. And of course, you could say actions in themselves are intrinsically good or not, but then there is still that unanswered question of why is that a case, if you got what I mean. And if you can truly write out a certain telos to humans, that I think that problem goes away quite quickly. In the sense that of assuming that you just use a theistic approach to and just say, well, human telos is that which draws into a relationship with God. Then you can develop it, or you can then tie it in with the idea of, well, it's via this telos that I have a fundamental understanding of. I have an understanding of, well, where do I go? Or I have an understanding of what I ought to do. A relationship with God is the most desirable thing. So what actually works towards a relationship with God? And the same goes with any other kind of telos you do. You do have some objective grounded as long as your telos is objective. And I think that also ties into my existentialist philosophy, especially under a theistic frame. Yeah, because essentially, especially if you have different theories. I think the funny thing with my existentialist theory is it fits in almost everything, in the sense that if it's for human happiness, you find that the solution is laid within you, and that Sisyphus's power of escaping the cycle or the meaningless cycle is within him, and that makes him happy. Or if it is the idea of and self-contentment, because the idea of self-contentment is the idea that you're happy with that which you have. And if the solution to all your problems is within you, then that's kind of by definition almost that which is within you. And it seems that the existentialist theory fulfills that as well. But I think it shines the best when you look at a theistic kind of framework, in the idea of, well, the best is the relationship with God. And well, if you have the understanding of God within you, or the concept of God within you, and I'm not to say you have a full extensive understanding of God within you. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I don't think that's true at all. But as long as that kind of idea of having that understanding within you further develops a relationship with God. And I think in that sense, I think the existentialist theory kind of fits perfectly with the idea of teleology.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I've been thinking again about your theory, and I feel like a critique that one can make is that it focuses too much on the inner life of human beings. Well, it would be absurd for you to say that. I guess, unless you have an objection to this, that, let's say, if you're utterly deprived of food, of shelter, you don't have clothes to wear, you're super cold. I don't think the solution would lie within. Then how would you, I guess, incorporate that into your new existentialist framework?
Well, I would think that perhaps we can. I think that the fundamental thing is that it's not necessarily an existentialist problem if we're talking about it being applied to the extrinsic physical world, because existentialism, I think, it's about the fight against nihilism. It's about the fight about meaning. And the analogy I like to turn to is a person I talk with in Africa. He struggles to put food on the table, and of course, I'm not sure whether he's trying to scam me when he says that or not. But I mean, the thing is that, well, he is struggling with the kind of the problems that we're discussing right now, but he is able to find the hope and life within him to kind of fight or overcome that rock or that problem. And the same way, I would suggest that, well, maybe us too, we can find that hope and that solution. We can find that existentialist theory within us, that infinite consciousness within us, irregardless of what is outside us in the world. And we should kind of separate the two. Of course, you have to focus on the physical, but at the same time, the physical, and I think this is what Christ says when he says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The bread alone is the physical world. That's very important. Christ isn't saying you shouldn't live by bread. Rather, he's saying as well, man fully focused on bread will lead to destruction. It's kind of like how suicide rates don't seem to disappear when humans have everything they need physically. The problem of suicide sometimes becomes even greater when we have our physical needs met. And the reason why, because of that is, well, the existential question of nihilism is still so real in our lives. And that's fundamentally what we have to struggle against. And I think that's fundamentally at the core of why I'm tempted to say desperate, but I'm also tempted to say I find it so important that we find this convincing solution to the problem of nihilism, which is accessible to everyone. And that's why I have my existentialist theory or my existentialist philosophy, because I think that almost everyone can access it, because I think there's nothing more evident than the fact that we have some sense of infinite consciousness within us. And as long as you can accept that presupposition, or that, not presupposition, because it's not a presupposition, it's not an axiom, but as long as you can accept that starting point, I think the existentialist theory basically follows.
Well, I don't even think it's something that you accept or not. It's almost like something that you embody, I guess.
Yeah.
I think you drew out a very good distinction between sort of existentialism is this fight within oneself, and of course there's external problems that you have to solve. But then, if you've got yourself in order, perhaps it'll be slightly easier for you to solve the problems without, even though it may still be very difficult. Life is very difficult anyway. My favorite Rilke quote that I repeat ad nauseum is everything important is difficult, everything is important. So yeah, and I completely forgot what I was going to say.
So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. As I've said before, we're going to be discussing the rest of our discussion in other videos as well. I'll separate them into bite-sized pieces so you can just access them a bit better. In this video, we have discussed my existentialist theory. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Furthermore, this theory or this discussion will be found on our podcast, Thinker's Kitchen, so you can go check that out. The link to that will be in the description below. Unfortunately, his YouTube channel, Thinker's Kitchen, has disappeared from existence, so there's no need to subscribe to that anymore. Just go check out our podcast, Thinker's Kitchen and Dostoevsky and Us. And on the other hand, we are going to be discussing about Warren's dream in the next video. So if you're interested in that, make sure to like and subscribe so you're updated whenever I upload that video. So thank you for watching. Like always, stay safe. God bless. I'll see you in the next video, and goodbye.